Hello, this is Stephen. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture, broadcasting from a very hot Western Europe. I think it actually might be cooling down a bit.
My name is Joy. I'm about 5'3", and measurement's 36, 24, 36, and English. My little baby's name's Johnny. He's quite a chubby little baby, and he cries a lot, most of all in the night.
She's still next door to you?
As ever.
Is she?
Her head behind the curtain.
Oh, they're like that next door to me, you know. I don't have nothing to do with them.
I've got long hair and green eyes. My legs are a bit skinny, actually. I don't like my legs very much. And the things I like most are plenty of clothes and money. Well, I was born in Fulham, and my mum had quite a few of us. She spent most of her time in the pub. My dad's a scaffold erector, and he likes the women. Well, I fell in the family way when I was 18, and I got married to a right bastard. Well, I didn't think so at the time, but I do now.
That was a clip from the 60s film, Poor Cow. That'll make sense later in this conversation. I'm a rock, I am an island, sang Paul Simon in 1965. Well, my guest today is called Roc, and he lives on an island. For more than 3 decades, Roc Sanford has been associated with the remote Hebridean Gometra, where he lives much of the year without mains, electricity, running water, or many of the conveniences of modern life. He's a British writer, artist, climate activist whose life has evolved from academic research into a remarkable experiment in off-grid living and ecological resistance. In The Boxer, 1968 song, also by Paul Simon, are the words, laying low, seeking out the poorer quarters where the ragged people go, looking for the places only they would know. And that also seems very relevant in this episode, because Roc was born to parents who deliberately turned away from wealth and privilege and chose to live closer to the working class world they wanted to understand and write about. And that was a choice that carried him as a child from Belgravia, one of the most exclusive areas in central London, to Chelsea, another very posh area, and then across the river to Battersea, as we will hear, and from there to Wales and onwards. We're going to hear more about Roc's parents and their influential work in film and the sort of broader countercultural moment that they helped to define. We're also going to get into experiments in the counterculture and the tensions that can emerge when idealism meets reality. We're going to hear about Roc's unusual schooling, his years during the AIDS crisis in New York, and the ideas that shaped his thinking about perception systems and the way that we interpret the world. We head to Soho. We meet Francis Bacon and Genesis P-Orridge again. We hear about Roc's first brush with the British law. Welcome if you haven't been to the Bureau before, and welcome back if you have. Thanks to all those who've written in and supported us. It's deeply appreciated. Check out all our stories, writing, much more, and help support our wild endeavours at bureauoflostculture.com. Roc is leading a big countercultural life. So this is the first part of a double-header conversation. Let's get into it. I'm very pleased to be reaching out across the land of Britain to an island off the west coast of Scotland, Gometra, to speak with Roc Sanford. Roc, welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you, Stephen.
I thought we should go back to the beginning and talk about how Roc came into the world, and because you had this kind of extraordinary artistic family. So tell us a little bit about that, where you were born, when you were born, and about your parents.
My parents came from quite privileged backgrounds and both rejected their backgrounds. I think they went on loving their families very much and interacting with their families, but they turned their backs on what they saw as sort of unfair privilege. And I think my dad went to Eton, and I think he was probably inspired by George Orwell, who was also an Etonian and who also wanted to just document the lives of people who were not being served well by the structure of the society. And so my dad did a lot of living rough and living with travellers and working in sort of very poorly paid jobs just to understand that world. And likewise, my mum also dropped out from sort of high society I was born, on my birth certificate, it says Eaton Square, which is like a very smart square in London, which is actually where I was born. But very quickly we moved to Cheyne Walk, which is like on the river in London. And yeah, we were next door neighbours to the Mick and Bianca Jagger. And then again, it wasn't down market enough for my parents. And we moved again to what was then known as a slum. I don't think people use the word so much these days, but it was like my first memories of this place we moved to, which was in Battersea, very close to the River Thames, quite low ground, and little houses, kind of 2 up, 2 down houses with outdoor toilets. I remember big Belfast sinks, which one would be washed in. You'd just stand in the sink and get washed, and cobble streets, and people still had horses, so there'd be horses going up and down the streets, and big old Victorian pubs with beer pumps. And, it was just a really old-fashioned, beautiful, charmed world. And because both my parents were working quite hard, making films and books, I would just get shut out. They'd just shut the door and I'd be shut out in the street and play with the other street kids, and I wasn't allowed to come home until evening, sort of thing.
I want to just sort of seat that for anybody who's not familiar with London. So Eaton Square is super posh. Cheyne Walk is only I would say a slight step down. It's I don't know what it was like then, much more groovy, I suppose, but it's pretty posh now. But then if you hop across the river, which directly across the river, isn't it, Battersea? Yeah, that was really a working class area, wasn't it? Apart from the bit around the park, it was very much a kind of the lowlands, quite a lot of industry, terraced houses, post-war council estates as well, right? So quite a change. Now, when your folks did that, was that driven by economics or ideology? Were they like, okay, we've actually got to go and live amongst the people that we're going to write about and make films about?
It's interesting. I think with my dad, it was probably a desire to disrupt and maybe a sort of resentment of the society. There could have been both a sort of altruistic motive and a resentment motive, possibly. And my mum was I think she was just she felt quite claustrophobic in the upper class society. And I think she was just thrilled to be amongst people who were honest and straightforward and having fun. And not that upper class people aren't straightforward and honest and having fun. It's just that she just didn't feel she belonged. So she went to work in a sweet factory, I seem to remember, and just was really happy.
That's so funny. Different kind of fun, I suppose, isn't it? When are we talking about then? Give us a sort of set the scene in terms of timing.
I was born in 1957, the end of 1957. And the times I'm talking about, which is the sort of first sort of times I remember, I very vaguely remember living in Cheyne Walk. But really my memories began in Battersea. It was a sort of paradise. It's interesting because slums are presented as bad places, but this one was like very, very strong community. Very friendly, trusting people, everyone supportive of each other. I feel that housing was affordable, so you could have your little 2 up, 2 down house. And yeah, it was really an idyllic life.
Tell us a bit more about your parents, because they did things which I would see really that sort of fundamentally shifted the British cultural landscape in some ways in terms of film. They kind of re-educated people in terms of some of the work that they made.
Well, it's interesting. I feel they're less well remembered in a funny way now. But I suppose you could say that because Orwell did incredible work in drawing attention to some of the stresses in the culture, but maybe he didn't translate into film. And I don't know when 1984 was made into a film, but that was sort of a slightly different subject. So it could be that what my dad did at least was sort of translated Orwell's work into film. And I think my mum was coming much more from a novelistic or more aesthetic angle than a moral angle. And I think she was just thrilled by the beauty of the life she was able to lead. And they were slightly competing with each other. And I get the feeling my dad was quite jealous of my mum's sort of perhaps coming into what he saw as his territory and doing extremely well at it. And they both ended up making films with Ken Loach that were quite influential, I think, at the time, although I think they're not so well remembered now.
I think they are remembered. Up the Junction and Poor Cow, and I mean, and then your dad's drama, Cathy Come Home. I don't know whether they're remembered in the sense that they're sort of in the forefront of public consciousness, but they're sort of recognised as being important British works on film.
Yeah, they're sort of angry young man period, as it were. I remember them as wonderful films, and I actually haven't seen them since those days.
Right, that's interesting. You've chosen not to watch them.
No, I want to watch them. It's just, I'd like to watch them with my children. I can never persuade my children to watch them. And I think Ken Loach recently said those films changed his life, and Up the Junction in particular, because they basically opened the whole world that was going to be his future to him.
And Up the Junction, of course, refers to Clapham Junction, which is not so far from Battersea, right?
Yeah, no, it's very, very close. I was marooned in a train which had broken down in Clapham Junction about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. And I was looking across to where we lived, and it was only a few hundred yards away, basically.
You grew up in this, like an artistic and a kind of politically ideological atmosphere of sort of social critique. You know, where did that lead you next?
I suppose the next big thing that happened was the Greater London Council decided to demolish our whole area. Basically, it was my whole world. And they moved everyone to Bracknell in Berkshire, which is very like what happened in the Soviet Union, where the sort of whole population was suddenly being moved somewhere else. And they came in with bulldozers and just flattened the whole area. And I remember going back with my dad. My dad always used to ride around on a sort of Vespa. So I remember going on his Vespa back to where we'd lived, and it was just this huge rubble field, which seemed to go on for miles. And we tried to work out where our street had been, and there were one or two landmarks that had remained, which let us sort of try and figure out where our house was. And then amongst the rubble, we found some of our possessions.
Wow, really?
Yeah, we could tell we were where our house had been.
That's amazing. What were they? Can you remember?
Well, in particular, what I remember is this transformer, big heavy metal transformer, which was made of plates in the shape of E's. So for some reason, you'd have a lot of plates in E shape stuck together. And I remember I used to sort of play with it because it was really heavy. When we went back, we found this place with lots of E's amongst the rubble. And we thought that's probably our house.
That's so strange. So you come back to Battersea, your past in a strange way, your sort of psychogeographical past has been sort of flattened, if not erased. And what happens next?
Parents went to live in Putney. They didn't want to go and live in Bracknell, which is understandable, perhaps. And so they moved to a house overlooking, it had a garden running down to the river, so it was amazing in Putney. When the river was very high, it would sort of flood into our garden, the Thames. And when it was low, we had a ladder we could climb down, and we used to swim in the Thames, amazingly. And I always used to think it was really fun to swim underwater and
That's brave.
catch someone's leg because they couldn't see you because it was so murky. I don't see children being allowed to swim the Thames in Putney these days, but perhaps they are.
I doubt it very much.
And I think my parents got a bit tired of living in London, so they moved to Wales, to a sort of Welsh mountain that was, again, very, very beautiful. Yeah, quite a crazy childhood. I think it was a bit too much for my mum. I shouldn't speak for her, but in the end, my mum and my dad broke up. It ended up being just my dad in Wales. And you couldn't always count on there being water, for instance. It was quite a sort of extreme place. Dad's solution was just to buy 60-gallon barrels of cider, and we'd live off the cider rather than water. And it was just, he bred horses, so there were just loads of horses that would come in and out of the house. And there was one gate you had to go through, and then you could ride for sort of 60 or 70 miles across a mountain. So it was just a wonderful, wonderful place. But quite tough as well. And because I found it quite tough, and I think my parents were quite alternative, or my dad was at least, so it was quite like living in a commune sometimes. And I was a child who really wanted my own space. So I actually moved out into a small shed that my dad bought for me and put up in the woods, probably about half a mile from his house. So every night I just walk through the darkness to that shed. And then in the morning, at breakfast time, one of my brothers would play the bugle, which I'd hear, and then I'd know it was time to go in and have some breakfast.
What sort of age were you?
I think that was we went to Wales probably when I was about 7, and I probably moved into my shed when I was about, 9. And I call that leaving home in a way.
Right. It sounds quite significant in terms of the way that you live now, actually. I'm going to come back to that for sure. So you said your father was quite alternative. It sounds by most people's standards very alternative, but I guess it was also, we're talking kind of like mid-60s, right? So it was a time when there was a lot of social ferment. The counterculture with a big C, as we talk about it, was sort of getting going, wasn't it? So there's a lot of experiments going on in terms of ways of living, ways of thinking about even how families could operate, right?
Yeah, there was, and it wasn't all happy either. It's interesting in that there was a liberation of people to be able to live in different ways. But I think some of those ways didn't necessarily serve everyone. Maybe there was some wisdom in the way that people had been living that was lost. As a child, it sort of felt like there was a lot of emphasis on non-hierarchical communities. But the result of that seemed to be that there was a lot of time spent in power struggles, because if there was a power vacuum, people had to, people tried to fill it. So it's interesting. It's sort of like we need to find better ways to live, and we need to experiment. But we need to do so with open eyes and avoid the obvious mistakes that just lead to disputes and rancor.
What I admire a lot about the counterculture is the experiments that went on, but you also have to be quite clear-eyed about the fact that some of them could be quite disastrous at times. They were experiments which didn't flower into good things necessarily.
Yeah, and they're very valuable, those experiments, because you need to know what doesn't work as well as what works. And there seem to be some regularities about what doesn't work, which get overlooked. Because I've experienced this power vacuum thing in lots and lots of contexts, and was always trying to figure out what the dynamics of it were. And someone must have told me about a piece of work called The Tyranny of Structurelessness by Jo Friedman, which is not a very long essay. And she was a feminist, a sort of radical feminist in the 1970s in America. And she noticed a pattern in all the feminist movements that she was involved with of lots of people coming together with goodwill towards each other in good faith, trying to create something, make something happen. And without an organized structure. And what would happen each time is an in-group would assume control of the movement. No one else would have any power of what happened. And there would be no way to change the in-group because there was no constitution, as it were. So I suppose she argues for the importance of having a constitution, and that if you don't have a constitution, you end up with a tyranny.
So there's young Roc in his shed at night, sort of summoned to breakfast by bugle. And you've got brothers, and I don't know what other siblings you have and stuff, but it sounds like your father was operating, you said it was a kind of commune, so there were people coming and going, were there, and people staying there and strangers appearing and disappearing.
Yeah, he was very idealistic about having loads of people coming and going, basically. And it didn't always work out. I mean, occasionally he would have disasters where people, perhaps very exploitative people, would come and not want to go and so on. But it definitely suited him. And he went on living like that to the end of his life, with like travellers living in buses around his house, and his house filled with various people and children running all over the place. It was a very wonderful way to live. But as you suggested, maybe it doesn't suit introverts. It's like an extrovert life. And people who need to be alone, it's a bit harder for. Yeah, it was quite extreme, that house in Wales, because I remember once there was a fire. No one woke up, but there was a fire downstairs. Luckily, the water was working at that stage, and the water pipes melted in the fire. And then the water squirted all over the kitchen where the fire was and put the fire out. But my dad didn't change anything. He just left it, with the melted pipes and the kind of blackened kitchen. And so he was very appreciative of found objects. Like he loved the brightly coloured plastic trays that you used to get out of chocolate boxes, and he'd sort of stick those on his windows. And he'd coat his walls in silver foil and things.
Did you ever crave conventionality?
It's interesting. Funnily enough, I went to live in Ibiza with a friend a few years ago in a small flat, and it was just a really ideal life. It had a little terrace, and there was a supermarket in the little village and so on. And everything worked very well. So I think there's a lot to be said for conventionality, basically.
When did you and how did you go to school? You're living in Wales, in a quite remote place, in a pretty countercultural setting. What about education, and how did that work out?
Well, when we'd lived in Battersea, I went to the local state school. And when we moved to Putney, my parents sent me to a private school, which was really for the children of the 60s kind of actors and film directors and people like that, where I was actually very unhappy for some reason. I didn't really like it at all. And then when they left Putney, I was sent to boarding school in Devon, so it's a school called Dartington, which was quite again, very idealistic, noble aspirations, which is that you leave children to develop themselves rather than deforming them with your, unnecessary rules and strictures. But also perhaps a bit naive, because sometimes it's really the problem of evil. Maybe no child is evil, but there are evil tendencies and good tendencies in everyone. And to assume everything's going to be all right may be naive. So it was really wonderful school, and I'm glad I went there. And there were some really good teachers and lovely people, very committed, but it also had serious problems.
It's quite famous, Dartington, isn't it? It's a sort of progressive education. But I'm guessing that maybe this is what you're referring to. You're going to get the same things of like bullying and stuff like that you get at other schools too, because the actual framework can be quite progressive, but children aren't necessarily progressive.
Yeah. Exactly. Like in a way, children are the most conservative of all in some ways. They're perhaps true to themselves if not interfered with too much. And themselves is a kind of timeless thing. So it closed down. And I think it became unviable because various tragic things happened and people got hurt. It's like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, in a sense. I mean, I think that was my experience. So I think it definitely made me stronger. And I gained a lot from it. But it's definitely caused trouble as well in my life that I probably haven't completely processed. And I need to get a move on, obviously, if I'm going to process before I'm done for.
Just to close one little loop, you said that, your parents had split and, you're living with your dad. What happened with your mum? I mean, where did she go? What did she do next?
She went to live in Somerset on Exmoor, which again, very like where my dad was like 1,000 feet up and very remote, often cut off by snow. So you had to have a lot of food in. Very much a horse life because both my parents were still in that horse culture where you basically went around by horse. And it sounds ridiculous, but that had been their childhood and they kind of never let it go. They were lucky enough to be able to go around by horse. And so my childhood, again, you just went around by horse and it seemed normal. So yeah, when I would go off to school, if I was with my mum on Exmoor, I'd ride to school, which took me about 3 days across Exmoor and Dartmoor. Very, very wild country. But it was boarding school, so it would just be, at the beginning and end of term.
So sounds like you survived Dartington rather than necessarily thrived, or maybe it was a combination of thriving and surviving. Obviously, it was your past, so it was just completely normal, but obviously by most people's standards, it was quite unusual past.
And yeah, I think there was a period I was very happy at Dartington, so I don't want to run it down. And it was an incredibly romantic childhood. It was a very, very beautiful place with a river going around it. So one was living a quite Arcadian life. Perhaps the way to put it is it's a bit like I think it's in The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, the Morlocks and the Eloi. It's like they're the very innocent, happy people picnicking, and then in the night people come and drag them away, sort of, sometimes a bit like that. And
right. What did you do next when you finished at Dartington?
I went to university and in Bristol, and I didn't really fit in and I didn't really feel very happy. I think I'm naturally quite academic, so I quite liked studying, but really my life, I'd kind of discovered London and had lots of friends in London. So actually, although I was supposed to be at university in Bristol, I ended up just hanging out in London, having a wild time. And when I left Bristol, I was lucky enough to go to America. There's a professor whose work I really liked, who worked on perceptual bias, which is the relationship between what we see when we look at things and what physics would tell us they were, and the way that there are sort of systematic distortions in the way we see things, like about how we get things wrong about what's actually out there. How we see things is what's important until it collides. I think the saying is you get mugged by reality. It's better to understand the way in which your perception is being distorted by the way you've evolved. So yeah, I lived in Manhattan for a while, which was incredible in those days. That was the early 80s. It was just before AIDS struck. And it was like very, very wild and exuberant and free world. And I suppose people took lots of risks with their lives. I don't mean with AIDS, but I mean you could afford to be a bum, as it were, because it was easy to find housing. The downside risks weren't like they are now. Now housing above all is just very, very difficult to find and pay for. That's the huge change between when I was young. Anyway, I was in Manhattan. Was really wonderful. I mean, it was wonderful and strange. People would scream all night, in neighbouring apartments. There'd be car chases out in the street. It was just very strange overstimulation, basically.
Quite a change, though. I mean, thinking about it, when we sort of skipped over your fun times in London, but which is late 70s, I'm guessing. So it's quite a ferment going on in this city at that time, in this kind of post-punk era, right? And then out into the heart of the beast in Manhattan, particularly at that time, right? Because, the early 80s, I mean, artistically and just in terms of, crazy times as well, I think just before AIDS, that kind of the immense tragedy of AIDS kind of ripped through that community, right?
Yeah, and completely destroyed it. And it's strange. It's a bit like when I described our home in Battersea being erased. That was houses. This was people. It's like so many people were killed by it. And yeah, it was appalling tragedy, people didn't see it coming. People began to realize something was wrong, and it just took out many, many incredible people in quite horrific ways as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I got this place to do a PhD with a professor in Pennsylvania, in this tiny town called State College, which when I actually drove there, it took about 5 hours to drive from Manhattan to State College. And I drove right through without realizing I got there, because it was only about, I don't know, it took about 2 minutes to drive through
Like a Welsh village.
Yeah, exactly. And so I ended up there, which again was quite interesting.
It's sort of Hicksville, by the sounds of it, in Penn State University. You became a kind of maths-based academic. Is that right?
Yeah, not very good mathematician, but I'm quite good mathematician for a non-mathematician, I think probably is how to place me. So I was very interested in using maths to understand sort of natural systems like rivers and mountains, and human systems like cities and, all that kind of thing. But I was particularly interested in this question of what the relation is between what we see and what physics would say was there.
Mm.
So to give an example, the professor I worked with, who was called Peter Gould, who was a really wonderful, lovely man, he would ask people how far away they thought Birmingham was, say, from London, if they live in London, and how far away they thought Glasgow was. And he found that there were very predictable regularities in how they got it wrong. So they'd think Glasgow was nearer than it actually was, but they behave as if it was nearer. They might take a job in Glasgow, but it's actually further than they think. My particular interest was figuring out why it was happening. So I would look at the underlying question of what people meant when they looked at numbers. And again, I've found really interesting regularities. And that then has massive implications, because obviously maths underlies a lot of natural phenomena. And if we're getting that wrong, we're just not necessarily, things aren't going to come out the way we think they're going to come out.
How has that affected what you went on to do? Because that sounds very academic, very, very niche. I mean, interesting, but it is looking at systems and how we perceive the world, right? I suppose what we're going to find out next is how that leads into what you did and what you've done with the rest of your life. So there you are in Penn State University doing a PhD. Did you finish that? Are you Dr. Roc or Doc Roc?
I didn't finish it, no. I got quite lonely there, and Peter very kindly said, pick a university. I can send you to any university in the world. And so I picked UCL in London because it was near Soho, and I loved Soho. So he wrote to UCL and said, you've got to take this guy. So I started doing a PhD in UCL. And actually, it was a really happy time for me, because I got a little flat in Brewer Street in Soho on the corner of Wardour Street. And Soho in that time was a bit like a ghost town, because don't know why, but I suppose it was a red light district. So that probably scared off a lot of other kinds of business. There were a lot of boarded up shops and shuttered places, and then lots of sex shops and peep shows where you put 50p in a slot and sort of letterbox opened and you could see someone stripping, and porn cinemas and that kind of thing. Sex workers. It was just a very wonderful place. There was sort of cultural thing from I don't know when it started, but it was certainly going strong in the 50s and still lingering on in the 80s, of having loads of very specialized drinking clubs. And the most famous is Muriel's, or the Colony Room. But that was only one of many. And they were just really lovely, all over the place in Soho, with their own clientele of people who would describe themselves as elderly queens, or all sorts of people. And then there were just beautiful pubs like the French House and the Coach and Horses. And there were nightclubs like Gaz's, Rocking Blues, and the Wag Club, and so on. So it was just a real dream place. And then I'd walk to UCL, which was about a mile away probably. And I was given a little room in the Senate House building, which is that very tall, monumental kind of fascist architecture building, which I think was probably used in 1984. I get the feeling it was used as a set in 1984.
Yeah, I think it's either the Ministry of Love or Ministry of Information, isn't it? Or something. Yeah. It's that sort of totalitarian Gothic, as they call it.
It's wonderful. It's incredible architecture. I was given a room at the top of that tower, which was inside the library. If you like reading, it was like a dream situation, because I could just wander through this huge Senate House library over many floors and carry back armfuls of books to my little room, and then go to sleep, and then go back to Soho and
sounds ideal.
The French pub and and murals.
Is that when you met Francis Bacon?
I can't remember where I met Francis Bacon, but it would have been the French or murals, I suspect. My dad lived in Soho. He moved back from Wales for a period. He lived in Greek Street, I think. And he made me a member of the Colony Room. So I became an honorary member of the Colony Room, murals. I think when I was 16, but it might not be true. And I remember him saying, he sort of briefing me before he first took me there, saying, like, the way people act in the Colony Room is to be rude as they can to you. So just don't take it seriously. So I sort of took that on board and we went, and everyone was saying, look what the cat's brought in.
This is a sidebar about the Colony Room Club. There was no sign worth noticing. It was just a battered green door on Dean Street, a steep flight of stairs, and if you were lucky, or interesting enough, a tiny room that became one of the great crossroads of post-war British culture. The Colony Room Club opened in 1948, and for about 60 years it existed somewhere between a pub, a salon, a refuge, and I guess a kind of theatre. It was too small to be grand and too disreputable to be fashionable, but artists, writers, actors, photographers, journalists, gamblers, aristocrats, rogues, insomniacs all found their way there. Soho was still rough around the edges then, and the Colony reflected the neighbourhood perfectly. Smoky, argumentative, cruel at times, funny, and gloriously indifferent to convention. At the heart of it was Muriel Belcher, sharp-tongued, instinctively generous, and magnificently difficult. She presided over the room like the proprietor of an unruly family. Membership was less a matter of applying, but more one of being invited. If Muriel liked you, you belonged. If you didn't, that was it. The Colony did become synonymous with the painter Francis Bacon, who spent countless afternoons and evenings there holding court, arguing about art and life and assembling a remarkable circle of friends. Around him were figures such as Lucian Freud, Frank Auerbach, John Deakin, Geoffrey Bernard, Muriel Belcher herself, Henrietta Mores, and an ever-changing cast of unknown painters, failed poets, fraudsters and accidental celebrities. Nobody came for the deco, they came for the conversation. What people really consumed was each other. Stories, rumours, insults, ideas, wit and gossip. Magazine articles, exhibitions, affairs and feuds all seemed to begin or end within those nicotine-stained walls. Success and obscurity sat shoulder to shoulder. A young artist might find themselves talking to an established master. Fleet Street columnists could be drinking beside a petty criminal. An actor might spend an afternoon with a philosopher. By the time the club closed in 2008, Soho itself had changed almost beyond recognition. The independent cafes, the drinking clubs, the late-night haunts, and the myriad independent shops were giving way to corporate change and soaring property prices. The Colony couldn't really exist in today's London. But it's not because people have stopped seeking creative communities, just because the fragile ecology that sustained places like that has disappeared. The Colony's become a sort of symbol of a lost Soho. Not because everybody there was a genius, but because it offered something increasingly rare, a place where outsiders could gather without purpose, and where, behind an anonymous green door, London's cultural life unfolded, one drink at a time.
Ended up being one of my main haunts, and it was just a lovely, lovely bar.
Francis Bacon loved it. I think when he was rich and very famous, he liked to go there because he was treated completely ordinary. They weren't surrounded by fawning people from the art industry, or fans even, in fact.
He was a strong enough character to not take any notice of fame and money in himself. He knew what he wanted. He was incredibly kind of loving and solicitous, which is not sometimes how he's presented. That was my experience of him. And he just wasn't, he just didn't take any notice of the fame and the money. He enjoyed gambling the money away and he enjoyed having it, but it didn't change who he was. And maybe Soho was a place where you could carry that off.
A great place to be as a 16, 18, 20-year-old.
Yeah, it was incredible. It was like a kind of paradise, strange paradise. Yeah, I often remember I once, at about sort of 11 at night in Soho, I once kicked an old tin can or a beer can down the road, and a policeman came up to me and said, "You're making too much noise." Just to contrast it with now, when it's like all night rave music and huge crowds streaming around. It was a really lovely overlooked place, right in the heart of London, teeming with people who were making wonderful work. My best friend for several years was called Robert Fraser, who was an art dealer. He was very sort of plugged into what was happening in America, and he brought some incredible people over. And then he had a tragedy, which was that they made an example of him.
Right, Robert Fraser was arrested with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and ended up serving 6 months for heroin possession, right?
There's a famous Richard Hamilton print of Robert and Mick Jagger being taken away in a police car, handcuffed to each other. And so I think that's seriously damaged Robert's life, because his gallery went bust and he had to kind of rebuild from scratch. And I suppose it was that period where we were friends, and he lived in Coventry Street, which was like a few hundred yards from me. And we'd often have breakfast together or lunch together, or, we'd touch base more or less every day. We'd always go to Gaz's together.
It sounds like you had much more important things to do than study.
It's hard, isn't it? To the extent that you're free, which not everyone is, then there's a lot of different things one might do. And it's actually quite hard to choose what to do. And it's very easy to be distracted. And actually, there's a concept, I think, of Aristotle's that's called megalopsyche, which is actually realizing what you're on the world to do. It's basically having the confidence in yourself to realize what you're here for and to make sure you deliver it,
right,
even if it's not what is expected of you by your culture or your family. And indeed, Nietzsche also says, which I think is lovely, there's one little path through the universe, which is yours and yours alone. Who on earth would not take it? In other words, just be true to yourself if you can, and obviously there are situations where you can't be, but to the extent you can, have the courage to be true to yourself.
Where did your path take you next?
Well, along the way, I came across some incredible people. I heard you interviewing Alaura, being really wonderful interview. It was lovely to hear her voice. Jen, her ex-partner, was one of the people I came across, and I really got on with them.
Genesis P. Orridge. Where did you meet Genesis?
My gran gave me this funny telly, which was like something out of Star Trek. It was like small red plastic telly. I sort of had hanging from a beam in my house, and occasionally I would switch it on as a joke, because I didn't really watch telly. And on one of the occasions I switched it on, Jen appeared, who I'd never met before. And I thought that he was, I was thrilled because I thought he was wonderful. And he was saying that television was a control mechanism and we had to pull out the plug, basically. And anyway, so I was very pleased because I'd never seen anything so interesting on telly. And then probably the next day, I'd like to think it was the same day, I went out to a club or a party, and there he was. So I went to say hello to him, and we became very close friends. And I used to go and visit him and Paula, as she was then, in Beck Road. And he wasn't without his sinister side, Jen.
I should say that again.
Yeah, he wasn't without his sinister side. He had some wonderful things he would do, like he'd smile at you, he'd sort of do a lovely smile, and then suddenly go and sort of drop it suddenly. Yeah. Don't know if you knew him, but he was very manipulative in some ways.
I didn't know him at all, actually. I've got a psychic TV story, which I'll share with you later, but I didn't know him. But I sort of feel like I've got to know him a bit, partly through making a program about him, but all through Paula and a few other people too. And of course, a great disruptor, valued for that. Let me just ask you though, did you become a devotee at the Temple of Psychic Youth?
He very kindly invited me to, but the idea of basically putting my most secret fantasies on a piece of paper, coming onto it, and then putting it into his archive, I don't know, I sort of drew the line at that. So I never formally became a member of the Temple of Psychic Youth.
That was what Alaura, Paula as she was, that was the thing which she dreaded most, having to open those.
But yeah, he was really good. He was shaking things up in a wonderful way. Because at the time, you didn't really see piercings, and he was very pierced all over. So he would clank as he walked along because he had so many piercings. And he had a lot of tattoos all over his body as well, and an amazing long pigtail in rainbow colours, strange haircut. He was very, very exotic, and possibly he would, he'd blend into the crowd now, but in those days he was very, very different from everyone, and very profound thinker, very skeptical of, like the propaganda society that we live in. Quite serious art historian. Like he produced an encyclopedia of art. I don't know what's happened to it, but he showed me it once. Very upset because his entire archive, which was about 2 tons, his and Paula's archive, Alaura's, and they got raided by the police, got disappeared basically. So they just lost everything. And yeah, he very, very kindly got me to help him on. Basically, he got a commission to write a ballet, and he got me in because he got this studio to record the ballet in. And there was what was then quite a new machine, which was a sampler for getting sounds out of nature and then using them for music and playing them back at different pitches. And he couldn't figure out how to work it. So he just got me in because I understood computers and I understood music. I spent several days with the Psychic TV crew making this album. And that was a lovely experience. Very generous of him to bring me in.
You mentioned then an incident which Alara talks about, but when they were actually in Kathmandu and they get raided by the police here. It's during this whole kind of satanic panic hysteria thing here, and their whole archive was taken away. They never got it back. It was another kind of injustice. But you also had a rather unfortunate encounter with the law, right?
And not just one, I'd say.
Well, the first one then.
Yeah, I went to, there was a club called the Pink Panther near my flat in Soho. It was one of the many, many lovely clubs in Soho. So you went up these very steep little stairs, and there was sort of a makeshift bar, and I went with some friends, and then all the friends went, so I just stayed on having a drink. And weirdly, the room suddenly filled with Alsatians, so it seemed to me. So people were on the dance floor, and suddenly there were Alsatians also dancing, sort of jumping up at people. And the Alsatians were followed by police. And so obviously it was a raid. And foolishly, I thought, I'll go on drinking my drink. One of the police people came and said, "Who sold you that drink?" I mean, I sort of began to realize it was an unlicensed club. I hadn't realized that. And they wanted to arrest the bar person who'd managed to disappear into the crowd. And I said, I'd rather not say, because I don't want to get anyone into trouble. And he went on sort of pestering me to identify the person. It was probably my fault for going on drinking. It's the illusion one's an observer rather than a participant, basically. And in the end, he said, "Surprise, surprise, you're being nicked." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "For being a sarcastic bastard." And then, yeah, which fair enough, probably. And then he sort of took me downstairs, and there was a police van waiting, with an open door waiting for whoever they arrested. And the person looking after the police van said, "What have you got on him?" to the policeman who'd arrested me. And he brought out of his pocket a big bag of white powder and said, "I found this in his pocket." And so it began looking very serious indeed to me, because that meant a long custodial sentence, basically. And I happened to be planning to paint my bedroom, so I had my pocket full of paint charts, and I happened to have a pen. So I immediately started writing down all the dialogue as it happened, basically. And they took me to the West End Central Police Station in Savile Row, and the room, we sort of walked into the main room, which I think is called the charge room, but I can't remember, where there were about 20 police people, and me still writing on my paint charts and writing down everyone's numbers on their shoulders and so on. I remember when I walked in, the sergeant said, "Oh, look, we've nicked a lumberjack. Take your coat off, Ponce," because I was wearing one of those check coats. And they told me to go and sit down at a table, and I could see on the table there was a pipe and a bag of grass. And I went and sat down at the table, and I said, "What are these doing here?" They said, "Mind your own business," or something. It went on like that with me going on writing all the dialogue. In the end, you can see, if you look at the paint charts, there's one which says, "You can write all you like, mister, it's not going to get you anywhere." And then the pen goes scraping across the paper because they grabbed the pen because they didn't like it. And they grabbed the paint charts as well. And meanwhile, they'd taken away my glasses and all my possessions and my keys and things, and they'd put them in a bag. And I said, "I want you to put the paint charts in the bag." And amazingly, they did. And then I said, "I want you to seal it." And amazingly, they did. So then they'd kind of incriminated themselves, because all that sort of dialogue was there, and it was proved to be true because it was then sealed. And then they tried to get me to sign this piece of paper where it had a list of my possessions. So it said sort of glasses, keys, a wallet, a pipe, bag of grass. And I said, "Well, I'm not going to sign it because they're not mine." But I was quite glad I'd been demoted from a bag of white powder to a bag of grass, but it still wasn't mine. And so I wrote on the piece of paper where I was supposed to sign it, "The bag of grass and the pot pipe are not mine." And again, they snatched away the pen and weren't amused because they felt I wasn't playing the game properly. And then they shut me up, and next morning they let me out. And I think they didn't charge me. They just didn't really know what to do, because I think they realized maybe it wasn't straightforward that they would actually manage to convict me. And so they took a while, some weeks, to charge me. And in the end, they charged me with a very trivial amount of cannabis, I think hoping that I'd think it wasn't worth fighting. And for me, foolishly, maybe it's basically where you take your stand, because it took about 5 years of going to court to get to the end of it. And maybe I shouldn't have taken a stand there because I wasted 5 years fighting them. But I somehow didn't have it in me to let it go. And luckily I had a good judge who basically was very nice about me in his summing up and very rude about the police. And various prosecutions the same people had made began to unravel after that. So I got acquitted, and then it turned out they'd been doing it to quite a lot of people. And I think it got disbanded, the Relief, as it's called.
And an ordeal dramatised later, right?
Yeah, BBC made a dramatisation of it. They invited me to play myself, which I was very excited about. And then they invited the police to play themselves, and they said no, perhaps understandably. And then they felt it's a bit unfair if I play myself and they don't play themselves. So I lost my chance of stardom.
But not the last of your interactions with the British legal system. And the next very big thing which we're going to talk about in your life, Roc, is Gometra, the island where you actually are now. But I think for now we should pause there. And I want to thank you for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture and ask you if you'll return to tell us the further adventures of Roc Sanford on another occasion.
There's nothing I'd like better.
Thanks very much to Roc. Looking forward to returning to his island Gometra to hear about life there and his activism and his work with Extinction Rebellion and all the other things that he's been up to. Here's a sidebar about Roc's parents. I didn't want to include it at the beginning because we just got going, but it does feel relevant both to these times and to his evolution. So his parents, Jeremy Sanford and Nell Dunn, met in the 50s, married in 1957. Now they both came, as we heard, from privileged backgrounds. Jeremy educated at Eton and Oxford, Nell the daughter of an aristocratic family. But they made this unusual decision. Rather than follow the lives that had been mapped out for them, moved to Battersea, where they raised their 3 sons and became part of a working class community whose lives and stories would profoundly shape their own. And out of those years came some works that kind of changed British culture in a way. In 1963, Nell Dunn published Up the Junction, a collection of stories that brought the voices of South London's women into British literature with a honesty that was almost unprecedented at the time, written in the rhythms of everyday speech, dealing with poverty, factory work, friendship, sex, abortion, while celebrating the humour and resilience of ordinary life. Ken Loach's television adaptation became one of the defining dramas of the decade and helped establish a new kind of documentary style of social realism. She followed it up with Poor Cow, the story of Joy, a young working class mother struggling to survive in London. That was published in 1967 and filmed the same year, again by Ken Loach, offering one of the first unsentimental portraits of a working class woman at the centre of a British novel and film. And like Up the Junction, it challenged assumptions about whose stories matter. Roc's father, Jeremy Sanford's most celebrated work arrived in 1966 with Cathy Come Home, written for the BBC's The Wednesday Play slot, again directed by Ken Loach. Drawing on extensive research and real case histories, it told the story of a young family slipping into homelessness. And the documentary style was so convincing that many viewers believed they were watching real events unfold. It was seen by more than 12 million people on its first broadcast, and it transformed public understanding of homelessness, helped inspire the creation of the charity Shelter, and I would say it remains one of the most influential television dramas ever made in this country. Jeremy continued to explore lives on the margins. Beyond his writing, he became a passionate advocate for people whose voices were rarely heard and working closely with Romany, Gypsy and traveller communities. Roc's mother, Nell, built an extraordinary body of work, novels, plays, journalism, with shared belief that storytelling could be a form of witness. I can resonate with that. Together they helped transform British television, literature and film, proving that drama could do more than entertain. It could expose injustice, influence public debate, and even help change the world. And it was into this rather extraordinary cultural world that Roc was born, a household alive with writers, filmmakers, artists and campaigners, where creativity was inseparable from a belief that counterculture can make a difference. And for listeners, if you're wondering what it was about the idea of the Temple of Psychic Youth, the sigil was something that if you wanted to be part of that temple, you would write down your intimate secret fantasies, ejaculate onto the paper if you were a man, and then send it into the headquarters. You don't have to do anything like that to join and support the Bureau. You'll be glad to know. But if you'd like to help us in these crazy wild endeavours and keep this place ad-free, do come and join us. You may have noticed my output's been getting a little erratic, probably could do with being more erotic, a bit more erratic of late. I've been getting rather overwhelmed with all that he's doing, and there's so much more that we would like to do. So come to thebureauoflostculture.com, join our Patreon, support us if you can with a financial contribution, but you can join for free. There's lots of good stuff there and news of upcoming events. But for today, thanks for listening. Let's keep listening. I will see you further down the road, over the hillsides, and round the bend for more of these tales from the other side.